I told you already, you don't belong here. Commander Reeves's voice boomed across the Coronado training range like thunder, making every head turn toward the small figure standing at lane 15. Harper Steele, barely 5'4" in her deep V-neck military green t-shirt and dark army pants, awkwardly gripped a worn M4 carbine with her left hand, her right hand completely immobilized in medical bandages. Her long neon blue hair caught the California sun like a target beacon among the sea of regulation buzz cuts. The dozen SEAL candidates erupted in harsh laughter. "Look at that left-handed grip," sneered Jackson Blake, a mountain of muscle in navy camo. "Can't even use her dominant hand. Might as well blindfold her too." More chuckles rippled through the group as Harper struggled to adjust the rifle for left-handed shooting, her movements appearing clumsy and uncertain. "Left-handed shooting in a right-handed world," mocked another candidate. "This ought to be entertaining." But in exactly 18 minutes, when that deep V-neck shirt tore during a heated confrontation, exposing the intricate tattoo of a sniper rifle surrounded by bullet casings etched across her left shoulder, the very shoulder from which her weak left hand drew its incredible power, every single person on that range would understand they had made the biggest mistake of their military careers. The image would freeze them mid-breath, detailed black ink showing not just any weapon, but the exact rifle configuration used by Ghost Unit Alpha's legendary ambidextrous snipers, operators trained to shoot with either hand with equal deadly precision. Commander Reeves himself would drop his sidearm, his face draining of color, as he recognized the marking that represented the most elite left-handed marksman in military history. The morning had started at 0500 hours for Harper, just like every morning for the past 3 months since she'd been assigned to the SEAL training facility at Coronado. In the dim light of her sparse quarters, she'd gone through her routine with mechanical precision. Shower, uniform, medication for the persistent nerve damage in her right hand, then the careful process of adapting her gear for left-handed use. She'd arrived at the range an hour before anyone else, using her instructor access to set up equipment and practice the left-handed grip adjustments that had become second nature over the past 18 months since the injury. Her movements carried an unconscious precision, folding equipment in specific patterns, checking corners automatically, maintaining tactical spacing even in the empty facility. These were habits burned so deep that even conscious effort couldn't erase them. The morning California sun cast long shadows across the range as Harper methodically arranged her gear. Each piece of equipment was positioned with deliberate care, ammunition sorted by type and taunt, rifle cleaning kit organized with military precision, shooting mat deployed at exact angles for optimal stability. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like the meticulous preparations of someone overcompensating for their limitations. To a trained eye, it was something else entirely. The first SEAL candidates began arriving at 0630, their conversations and laughter cutting through the morning quiet. Harper continued her preparations, seemingly oblivious to their presence, but her peripheral awareness cataloged each arrival, each voice, each potential threat or ally in the social battlefield about to unfold. "Well, well," came a voice dripping with condescension. "Look what we have here." Jackson Blake stood 6'3", with the kind of muscular build that spoke of countless hours in the gym and an ego to match. His navy camo was pristine, his equipment expensive and perfectly maintained. Everything about him screamed elite warrior, from his confident stance to the way his squad naturally gravitated toward him for leadership. "Morning, Jackson," Harper replied quietly, not looking up from her equipment check. Her voice carried a slight Midwest accent that somehow made her seem even more out of place among these coastal elites. "That's quite a setup you've got there," Jackson continued, his tone suggesting amusement rather than respect. "Looks like someone's been watching too many movies about special forces. You do realize this is the real deal, right? Not some Hollywood fantasy where the underdog gets lucky." The other candidates chuckled appreciatively at their leader's wit. Among them was Ethan Cross, barely 21, and still carrying the wide-eyed earnestness of someone who believed in the honor of service above personal glory. He shifted uncomfortably at Jackson's mocking tone, but said nothing. Harper finished organizing her gear and stood, adjusting the rifle to her left shoulder with fluid economy of motion. For just a moment, the weapon seemed to settle naturally into position, as if it belonged there, before she awkwardly shifted her grip to accommodate her bandaged right hand. "Southpaw disadvantage," Jackson observed with false sympathy. That's gotta be rough in a right-handed military. Bet you're counting the days until that hand heals and you can shoot properly again. I manage, Harper said simply. Commander Reeves approached the group with the kind of bearing that announced his presence before he spoke a word. 22 years of naval service had carved lines into his weathered face and given him the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Ladies and gentlemen, Reeves announced, his voice carrying easily across the range, today we're conducting precision marksmanship assessment. Each of you will demonstrate your capabilities at various distances and under different conditions. Standards are high, and there are no participation trophies. His gaze swept over the assembled candidates before settling on Harper with obvious displeasure. I'll be honest with you people. I have serious reservations about any instructor who can't use both hands effectively. This is elite training for elite warriors, not a rehabilitation center for the walking wounded. The candidates exchanged glances, some smirking at their commander's bluntness. Harper's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, not hurt or anger, but a kind of weary recognition, as if she'd heard similar words many times before. Sir, Ethan Cross spoke up, his voice carrying a slight tremor of nervousness. Wouldn't it be possible to switch to left-handed weapons? I mean, there are accommodations that could help. Accommodations? Reeves turned on the young man with withering disdain. Son, do you think the enemy is going to accommodate your instructor's limitations? Do you think terrorists are going to wait while she figures out how to hold her weapon properly? The laughter that followed was harsher now, edged with the kind of cruelty that thrived in hierarchical environments where weakness was seen as contagious. Harper watched the exchange with apparent calm, but those paying close attention might have noticed the slight adjustment in her stance, the unconscious shift to a position that offered better fields of fire and multiple exit routes. Dr. Sarah Hayes arrived with the morning's second wave of personnel, her medical bag and tablet marking her as the facility's consulting physician. She was a woman in her 40s with the kind of competence that came from years of treating combat injuries, but also the bureaucratic caution of someone who'd learned to document everything for liability purposes. I need to conduct a motor function assessment, Dr. Hayes announced, approaching Harper with professional detachment. The regulations require verification of instructor capability, especially given the reports of significant nerve damage in your dominant hand. Harper extended her left hand for examination, and Dr. Hayes began a series of tests: grip strength, fine motor control, coordination exercises. As the doctor worked, her frown deepened. This is unusual, she murmured, loud enough for the nearby candidates to hear. The non-dominant hand shouldn't show this level of dexterity. Typically, when someone loses function in their primary hand, it takes months or even years to develop comparable skill with the other. She trailed off, studying Harper's fingers as they performed complex manipulation tasks with surprising fluency. The left hand moved with a precision that seemed almost unnatural, as if it had been trained for exactly these kinds of movements long before necessity demanded it. Have you had previous training with ambidextrous techniques? Dr. Hayes asked. Some, Harper replied, offering no elaboration. Jackson Blake had been watching the examination with growing amusement. Holy cow, Doc, you're making it sound like she's some kind of secret weapon. It's just muscle memory, right? Like when you learn to write with your offhand after breaking your arm? Not exactly, Dr. Hayes said slowly. What I'm seeing here suggests systematic training rather than adaptation. The neural pathways for this kind of bilateral coordination typically require years to develop. Years of what? Reeves interrupted impatiently. Dr. Hayes seemed to catch herself before saying something she shouldn't. Years of practice, Commander. Extensive practice. The moment passed, but several of the more observant candidates filed away the exchange for later consideration. Harper had returned to her equipment check, but her left-hand movements as she handled various pieces of gear were drawing subtle attention. Each motion was economical, purposeful, speaking of countless repetitions in environments where efficiency meant survival. Captain Morrison had arrived during the medical examination and positioned himself at the observation platform overlooking the range. Unlike the candidates, he wasn't here to train or be evaluated. His presence suggested something more official, more scrutinizing. He carried a tablet and occasionally made notes, his attention focused less on the candidates' bravado and more on their actual capabilities. When he looked at Harper, his gaze lingered longer than strictly necessary. Something about her stance, her movement patterns, her unconscious tactical awareness triggered recognition pathways in his experienced mind. He'd spent enough years in special operations to know when he was looking at real training versus someone playing soldier. "All right, people," Reeves called out. "Let's begin with basic weapons handling. Each of you will demonstrate field stripping and reassembly of your assigned weapon. Standard time limit applies." The candidates moved to their stations with varying degrees of confidence. Jackson Blake attacked his rifle with aggressive competence, his movements sharp and military precise. Others worked more methodically, their training evident but their experience clearly limited to classroom environments. Harper approached her station with apparent reluctance, the bandaged right hand making even simple tasks visibly awkward. She picked up her weapon with her left hand and began the disassembly process, her movements initially fumbling and uncertain. "This is painful to watch," Jackson commented loudly enough for everyone to hear. "How is she supposed to teach us anything if she can't even handle basic equipment?" But as Harper continued working, something began to shift. Her left hand found its rhythm, and the fumbling movements gave way to a fluid precision that seemed to surprise even her. The weapon came apart in her hands with increasing speed and confidence, each component separated and arranged with textbook perfection. 37 seconds later, Harper set down the last piece of her fully disassembled rifle. The range had gone quiet. "Holy cow," someone whispered. Jackson Blake stared at his own partially disassembled weapon, then at Harper's perfectly organized array of components. His best time with full use of both hands was 42 seconds. Most of the other candidates were still working. "Left-handed ejection port modifications would have made that faster," Harper observed quietly, seemingly to herself. "But the standard configuration works if you adjust your grip angle by approximately 15 degrees and account for the altered leverage dynamics." The technical knowledge in that casual comment hung in the air like a revelation. The kind of detailed understanding Harper had just displayed didn't come from basic training or civilian shooting courses. It came from extensive experience with weapon systems under varying conditions and constraints. Dr. Hayes looked up from her tablet, where she'd been timing the exercise. "That level of technical knowledge? Where exactly did you acquire that information?" Harper seemed to realize she'd said too much. "Training manuals," she replied simply. But Jackson Blake wasn't ready to let the moment pass. His ego, bruised by being outperformed by someone using their weak hand, demanded reassertion of dominance. "Lucky muscle memory," he declared with forced confidence. "Anyone can get fast at taking apart the same weapon over and over. But speed doesn't mean accuracy, and accuracy doesn't mean effectiveness under pressure. How about we test something that actually matters?" He gestured toward the advanced equipment assembly station, where candidates were expected to configure complex targeting systems and communication gear under time pressure. "Left-handed equipment assembly challenge," Jackson announced. "Let's see how your training manual knowledge holds up when you're working with gear you can't just memorize." The other candidates gathered around, sensing drama. This was no longer just training. It was a public challenge to Harper's credibility and right to be there. Ethan Cross looked uncomfortable with the escalating tension, but didn't intervene. Harper looked at the assembly station, then at Jackson's expectant face. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Not fear or uncertainty, but a kind of calculation, as if she were weighing costs and benefits of various responses. "Fine," she said quietly. The advanced equipment included radio systems, optical devices, and tactical computers, the kind of complex technology that required extensive training to operate effectively. Jackson attacked the challenge with aggressive confidence, his movements quick and decisive as he worked to configure the systems. Harper's approach was different. She examined each piece of equipment carefully before touching it, her left hand exploring connection points and interface mechanisms with what appeared to be unconscious familiarity. Her movements were slower than Jackson's, but carried a precision that suggested deep understanding rather than desperate improvisation. When both candidates finished, the results were undeniable. Jackson's assembly was functional but awkward, with several suboptimal connections and one minor error in the communication array. Harper's configuration was textbook perfect, with every connection optimized and every system properly integrated. The silence that followed was deafening. Using only her left hand, Captain Morrison observed from the platform, his voice carrying clearly across the range. "That's remarkable technical competence for someone supposedly limited by injury." Jackson Blake's face had gone red, a combination of embarrassment and growing anger. Being outperformed once could be dismissed as luck, but twice suggested something more systematic. something that threatened his position as the alpha among the candidates. "This is ridiculous," he declared. "Nobody develops that kind of expertise overnight, especially not with their offhand. Either she's been lying about her limitations, or—" He trailed off, not quite ready to voice his suspicions, but clearly thinking along lines that made him uncomfortable. Ethan Cross had been watching Harper's performance with growing recognition. Unlike the others, he'd been paying attention to details beyond just the results. The way she moved, the unconscious habits that emerged under pressure, the micro-expressions that suggested depths of experience far beyond what her position as an instructor should provide. "Your left-hand trigger discipline is perfect," he observed quietly during a break in the confrontation. "That's not something you learn from manuals or develop by accident. That's thousands of hours of training." Harper looked at him sharply, as if surprised that someone so young could read the signs so clearly. "Everyone develops habits," she replied carefully. "Not those habits," Ethan pressed gently. "I've seen enough training footage to recognize professional-level technique. The way you handle equipment, the way you position yourself in relation to potential threats, that's not instructor-level competence. That's operator-level muscle memory." Before Harper could respond, Dr. Hayes approached with her tablet, her expression troubled. "I've been reviewing your medical files," the doctor said, her voice carefully neutral. "There are some inconsistencies I'd like to discuss. The dominant hand injury reports don't quite align with the motor function I'm observing in your left hand. The development of bilateral coordination you're displaying typically requires what, Doctor?" Commander Reeves interrupted, clearly frustrated with the day's surprises. Dr. Hayes hesitated, glancing between Harper and her tablet. "Typically requires systematic bilateral training from an early age, or extensive rehabilitation following ambidextrous combat specialization programs." The words hit the group like a physical impact. Ambidextrous combat specialization wasn't something taught in regular military training. It was the domain of elite units with classified operational requirements. If watching Harper endure this public humiliation makes your blood boil just like mine, smash that like button right now. This story of hidden strength deserves to be seen by everyone. Subscribe and hit the notifications bell, because what happens next will make you believe that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates. Jackson Blake had heard enough. The combination of being repeatedly outperformed and the growing evidence that Harper was something other than what she appeared had pushed him past rational thinking. His approach to problems had always been physical and direct, and this situation called for reassertion of dominance. "This is nonsense," he declared, moving closer to Harper with obvious intent to intimidate. "I don't care what fancy training you claim to have. I don't care about your mysterious medical files or your convenient left-handed expertise. This is about reality, and the reality is that you're taking up space that belongs to real warriors." His movement brought Yi within Harper's personal space, close enough that his superior size and reach became weapons in themselves. The other candidates watched with the kind of anticipation that preceded violence, while Ethan Cross looked increasingly uncomfortable with the escalating aggression. "You need to step back," Harper said quietly, her voice carrying no trace of fear, but also no challenge, simply a statement of boundary. Jackson laughed harshly. "Or what? You'll file a complaint? Report me for hurt feelings? This is the real world, instructor. Sometimes people get their hands dirty." He reached out to accidentally bump Harper's left elbow, the same targeting of her supposedly weak side that he'd used earlier. But this time, Harper's response was different. Instead of absorbing the contact passively, she shifted her weight slightly, and Jackson's bump met empty air as she moved just enough to make him stumble. The movement was so subtle that most observers barely noticed it, but to those with trained eyes, it was revealing. Harper hadn't retreated or cowered. She had used Jackson's aggression against him with a precision that spoke of extensive close-quarters training. "Did you see that?" Captain Morrison murmured to himself, making a note on his tablet. Jackson's stumble had only increased his anger. He straightened up with flushed cheeks and clenched fists, clearly preparing for another attempt at physical intimidation. But before he could move, Harper did something that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. She switched the rifle to her left shoulder with a fluid motion that seemed to require no conscious thought. The weapon settled into position as naturally as breathing, and for just a moment, her stance shifted into something that professional warriors would recognize as a combat-ready posture. Then the moment passed, and she was back to appearing awkward and uncertain. But several people had caught that instant of transformation. "That movement," Dr. Hayes started to say, then stopped herself. "What movement?" Reeves demanded. The doctor shook her head. "Nothing, Commander, just muscle memory." But it wasn't nothing, and everyone present knew it. They'd just witnessed a glimpse behind Harper's carefully maintained facade, and what they'd seen suggested depths of capability that her position as a disabled instructor couldn't possibly explain. The group's attention was momentarily diverted by the arrival of additional personnel. Range Officer Martinez approached with his daily checklist and equipment manifest, his presence adding another layer of bureaucratic scrutiny to an already tense situation. "I need to verify left-handed qualification scores," Martinez announced, consulting his tablet. "We've had questions from headquarters about modified training protocols and accommodation requests." His words carried implications that went beyond simple administrative procedure. Someone higher up the chain of command was paying attention to Harper's situation, and not necessarily in a supportive way. "What kind of questions?" Captain Morrison asked from the observation platform. Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Questions about the validity of instructor certifications obtained under non-standard conditions. Questions about whether alternative training methodologies actually prepare candidates for real-world operational requirements." The bureaucratic language couldn't hide the real meaning. Harper's position was under review, and today's performance would likely determine whether she kept her job or was quietly transferred to a less visible assignment. Jackson Blake sensed opportunity in the official scrutiny. "That's exactly what I've been saying," he declared loudly. "How can someone who can't even hold a weapon properly be trusted to train elite operators? This isn't about accommodation or fairness, it's about standards." His words carried the weight of obvious truth, at least on the surface. Military training was supposed to be demanding, unforgiving, and based on measurable performance rather than sympathy for individual limitations. The logic was unassailable, which made Harper's situation increasingly precarious. But Ethan Cross had been watching Harper's reactions throughout the confrontation, and what he saw troubled him. Instead of the defensive anger or desperate justification he'd expect from someone in over their head, Harper displayed a kind of calm acceptance that suggested she'd faced far worse challenges than aggressive candidates and bureaucratic reviews. "Maybe we should focus on actual performance rather than assumptions," Ethan suggested quietly. Jackson turned on him with immediate aggression. "Nobody asked for your opinion, recruit. You've been here exactly how long? 5 minutes? Maybe learn to keep your mouth shut until you understand how things work." The dismissal was harsh enough to make Ethan step back, but it also revealed something about the social dynamics among the candidates. Jackson's leadership was based primarily on intimidation and the assumption that his confidence reflected actual competence. When that confidence was challenged, his response was to attack rather than to demonstrate superior capability. Harper maintained her perfect left-handed ready position, despite the mockery and official scrutiny, her stance never wavering, even as the conversation grew increasingly hostile around her. The rifle remained steady in her grip, positioned with a precision that spoke of countless hours of practice under far more demanding conditions than anything these candidates could imagine. But she said nothing, offered no defense of her qualifications or angry response to the mounting criticism. Her silence wasn't the silence of someone overwhelmed or defeated. It was the silence of someone who understood that words were less important than results, and that results would speak for themselves when the time came. That time was approaching faster than anyone realized. Harper's medical monitor displayed readings through her advanced cardiac device, featuring military-grade technology capable of functioning under extreme stress conditions. The portable diagnostic equipment had been developed specifically for combat medics, providing hospital-grade monitoring capabilities in a compact, shock-resistant package designed to meet rigorous military specifications and perform reliably in harsh battlefield environments. The monitoring equipment caught Dr. Hayes' attention as she reviewed the morning's data. Harper's physiological responses were remarkably stable, despite the increasing social pressure and open hostility she was facing. Most people would show elevated heart rate, increased cortisol levels, and other stress indicators when subjected to this kind of sustained challenge to their competence and right to be present. Harper's readings were those of someone completely at ease. "That's unusual," Dr. Hayes murmured, studying the data more closely. "These stress response patterns, they're not what I'd expect from someone in her position." Captain Morrison looked up from his own observations. "What would you expect?" flight or fight responses, elevated anxiety markers, the physiological signature of someone operating outside their comfort zone. Dr. Hayes paused, comparing readings across different time periods. Instead, I'm seeing the kind of baseline stability associated with extensive stress inoculation training. The implications of that observation hung in the air like a question mark. Stress inoculation training wasn't part of standard military education. It was a specialized technique used to prepare operators for high-pressure environments where normal human responses could be fatal. Jackson Blake had been listening to the medical discussion with growing frustration. Every revelation about Harper seemed to complicate what should have been a simple narrative about an unqualified instructor taking up space meant for real warriors. Instead of revealing weakness and incompetence, each test and examination uncovered new evidence of capabilities that didn't fit her official position. "This is getting ridiculous," he declared. "I don't care what her heart rate is or how steady her hands are. The bottom line is simple. Can she do the job or can't she? And if she can't use both hands effectively, then she can't do the job." His appeal to practical logic resonated with several of the other candidates, who were growing tired of the morning's complications and mysteries. They'd come to train, not to solve puzzles about their instructor's background. Commander Reeves seemed to agree. "Blake makes a valid point. Whatever Miss Steele's qualifications might have been before her injury, the current reality is that she's operating at reduced capacity. That's not acceptable for someone responsible for training the Navy's elite operators." The official pronouncement carried weight, but it also forced the situation toward a conclusion that Harper had apparently been trying to avoid. She'd been content to endure mockery and skepticism as long as it didn't interfere with her ability to do her job. But now her job itself was being questioned. "Commander," she said quietly, speaking for the first time in several minutes, "would you be willing to base that assessment on actual performance rather than assumptions about limitations?" Her voice carried a subtle challenge, offered with enough respect to avoid insubordination, but firm enough to demand a fair hearing. Reeves considered the request. "What kind of performance are you proposing?" "Range shooting begins at 0900 hours, Harper replied. "Judge my capability based on results under standard conditions." The proposal was reasonable, even obvious, but something in her tone suggested she wasn't just asking for a fair chance. She was offering to demonstrate something that would resolve all doubts about her qualifications. Jackson Blake sensed the shift in dynamic and moved to maintain his position of authority. "Fine, but let's make it interesting. You're asking us to trust our training to someone who can't even hold a weapon properly. The least you can do is prove you're not completely hopeless." His challenge carried the implicit threat that failure would result in immediate dismissal, not just professional disappointment. Harper seemed to understand the stakes, but her expression remained calm and focused. "The tension is building, and you can feel something big coming. If you're as invested in Harper's story as I am, drop a comment below about your own experiences with being underestimated. Share this video with someone who needs to see that strength comes in unexpected forms." The range shooting began as scheduled, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation rather than routine evaluation. Word had spread among the base personnel that something interesting was happening at the marksmanship assessment, and the usual small audience had grown to include off-duty instructors, administrative staff, and even some senior officers who normally wouldn't attend candidate evaluations. Harper's left-handed stance drew immediate attention as she approached the firing line. The weapon configuration that should have been awkward and uncertain instead appeared surprisingly natural, as if she'd been shooting this way for years rather than months. "Textbook form," observed Master Sergeant Williams, one of the range's senior instructors. "That's not adaptation. That's systematic training." The observation was noted by several of the watching officers, adding another layer of mystery to Harper's background. Master Sergeant Williams had 30 years of experience and had seen every kind of shooter the military produced. His recognition of professional-level technique carried significant weight. Captain Morrison had positioned himself where he could observe both Harper's performance and the reactions of the other participants. His tablet showed a database search in progress, with Harper's name triggering multiple classification flags that required elevated clearance to access. "Interesting," he murmured to himself as the search results populated. Meanwhile, the candidates took their positions for the first firing exercise. Jackson Blake moved with aggressive confidence, his stance and grip demonstrating the kind of competence expected from someone seeking elite military training. The other candidates showed varying levels of skill, but all fell within acceptable parameters for their experience level. Harper's position at the left end of the firing line put her slightly apart from the group, which seemed appropriate given her status as instructor rather than candidate. But the isolation also highlighted the contrast between her apparent limitations and the focused intensity she brought to the weapon handling process. "Range is hot," announced the range safety officer. "Commence firing." The first exercise was precision shooting at 100 yards, a basic test of marksmanship fundamentals under controlled conditions. Jackson Blake fired his first round with confidence, achieving a solid hit in the 8 ring. The other candidates followed with generally competent performance, their scores reflecting adequate training and natural ability. Harper's left-handed stance drew attention as she prepared to fire. The rifle seemed to settle naturally into position, and her breathing control was immediately apparent to the experienced observers. When she fired, the shot placement was center mass, not spectacular, but professionally competent. "Good shot," Ethan Cross offered quietly. But something was off. Harper's second shot missed the target entirely, sailing wide to the left in a way that suggested fundamental problems with windage or sight alignment. The miss drew surprised murmurs from the watching crowd and satisfied nods from those who'd been predicting failure. Jackson Blake couldn't resist commentary. "There's the reality check we've been waiting for. One lucky shot doesn't make up for fundamental incompetence." Harper's third shot was even worse, missing not just the target, but the entire backstop. The range safety officer called a temporary halt to address what appeared to be a serious safety issue. "Miss Steele," Commander Reeves called out with obvious frustration, "your weapon appears to be malfunctioning or improperly zeroed. We can't continue with unsafe firing." Harper examined her rifle carefully, checking the sight alignment and trigger mechanism. After a moment, she made a discovery that changed everything. "The rifle's been sabotaged," she announced calmly. "The sight has been deliberately misaligned, and the trigger mechanism has been altered to affect shot placement." The accusation hung in the air like an explosive device. Sabotage implied deliberate interference with military equipment, which was a serious offense under any circumstances. But the timing and targeting suggested something more personal, an attempt to ensure Harper's failure through means other than fair competition. Jackson Blake's reaction was immediate and defensive. "That's a serious accusation. You better have proof before you start throwing around charges like that." Harper held up the rifle, pointing to specific modifications that were visible upon close inspection. "The front sight post has been loosened and rotated approximately 12 degrees clockwise. The trigger spring has been replaced with one that provides inconsistent release pressure. Both modifications would cause exactly the kind of shot pattern we just observed." Master Sergeant Williams approached to examine the weapon. After a thorough inspection, his expression grew grim. "She's right," he announced. "This weapon has been deliberately altered. The modifications are subtle but effective. They had caused consistent shooting problems while appearing to be equipment malfunctions rather than sabotage." The revelation transformed the entire situation. What had appeared to be evidence of Harper's incompetence was actually proof that someone had gone to considerable lengths to ensure her failure. The question was who and why they'd felt such extreme measures were necessary. Commander Reeves's expression had shifted from frustration to anger. "This is a serious breach of military protocol and basic honor. I want an immediate investigation into who had access to this weapon and when these modifications were made." But Harper raised her hand to interrupt. "With respect, Commander, I'd prefer to resolve this through demonstration rather than investigation. If I could have an unmodified weapon, I believe the results would speak for themselves." The request was reasonable, but something in her tone suggested that she was offering more than just a second chance. She was preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would render all previous doubts irrelevant. A replacement rifle was quickly provided, thoroughly inspected by Master Sergeant Williams to ensure it was in proper working condition. Harper examined the weapon with professional thoroughness, checking every component and system before declaring herself satisfied. The database search on Captain Morrison's tablet had completed, and the results were making him increasingly uncomfortable. Harper Steele's official record was thin and unremarkable, but the classification flag suggested extensive redacted information requiring clearance levels far above anything needed for a simple marksmanship instructor. "Range is hot," the safety officer announced again. "Commence firing when ready." Harper's left-handed stance was steady and confident as she acquired her target. When she fired, the shot struck dead center with a precision that drew immediate attention from every qualified observer present. Her second shot struck within millimeters of the first, creating what appeared to be a single enlarged hole in the target center. The third shot was equally precise, and by the fourth shot, it became clear that Harper wasn't just shooting competently. She was shooting at a level that exceeded anything the candidates could achieve, despite using her supposedly non-dominant hand. "Holy cow," someone whispered in the watching crowd. Jackson Blake stared at the target display with disbelief. "That's impossible. Nobody shoots that accurately with their offhand, especially not someone who's supposedly injured and limited." But the evidence was undeniable. Harper's shot group was tighter than anything achieved by the candidates using both hands and years of training. The precision she was displaying represented thousands of hours of practice under demanding conditions. Master Sergeant Williams was studying Harper with new interest. "That shooting technique, I've seen it before. That's not standard military marksmanship. That's specialist-level precision shooting." His observation carried implications that made several of the watching officers exchange meaningful glances. Specialist-level precision shooting was the domain of very specific military units with very specific operational requirements. Dr. Hayes had been monitoring Harper's physiological responses throughout the shooting exercise, and the data was revealing patterns that didn't match her official background. Her stress responses during precision shooting are consistent with someone who's performed under combat conditions. These aren't the readings of someone learning or adapting. They're the readings of someone applying well-practiced skills. The medical assessment added another layer of evidence that Harper was something other than what her position suggested. Combat stress conditioning wasn't something that could be faked or simulated. It was the result of actual experience under fire. Captain Morrison closed his tablet and made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire morning. "Miss Steele," he called out from the observation platform, "could you join me for a moment? I have some questions about your background that need immediate clarification." The summons carried official weight, and Harper responded by securing her weapon and reporting to the platform with military bearing that was instantly recognizable to everyone present. Her movement from the firing line to the observation platform was accomplished with the kind of tactical awareness and controlled precision that spoke of extensive field experience. "Sir," she said, coming to attention before Captain Morrison, "your shooting performance has raised some questions," Morrison began carefully. "Questions that go beyond simple marksmanship assessment and into areas of operational capability and background verification." Harper's expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she'd been expecting this moment and had prepared for it. "I understand, sir." Morrison consulted his tablet, reviewing the classified information that had been revealed by his database search. "According to available records, your last assignment before coming here was medical rehabilitation following combat injuries sustained in classified operations. Is that correct?" The question was phrased in a way that offered Harper the opportunity to provide additional information without directly asking her to violate security protocols. But it also put her in the position of having to choose between maintaining her cover and providing information that could explain her demonstrated capabilities. "That's correct, sir." "And the nature of those classified operations. Would they have included specialized training in ambidextrous combat techniques?" The question hung in the air like a revelation. Morrison wasn't just asking about Harper's background. He was demonstrating that he already knew enough to ask very specific questions about capabilities that went far beyond standard military training. Harper hesitated for the first time since the morning began, weighing options and consequences with the kind of calculation that suggested experience with situations where the wrong answer could have serious implications. Before she could respond, the situation was interrupted by an escalation that would force all hidden truths into the open. Jackson Blake had been listening to the exchange between Harper and Captain Morrison with growing frustration and suspicion. The mounting evidence that Harper was something other than what she appeared threatened not just his assumptions, but his entire worldview about military hierarchy and natural order. "This is insane," he declared loudly enough to interrupt the official conversation. "We're standing here acting like some elaborate mystery when the truth is obvious. Either she's qualified or she's not. Either she can do the job or she can't. And if she's been lying about her background, then she definitely can't be trusted." His words carried enough truth to resonate with some of the other candidates, who were growing tired of complications and mysteries when they'd expected straightforward training. The appeal to simple logic was seductive, especially for people who preferred clear answers to complex questions. Commander Reeves found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between official inquiry and candidate frustration. The morning had produced far more questions than answers, and the growing crowd of observers was making the situation increasingly public and potentially embarrassing. Blake raises valid concerns, Reeves acknowledged. Perhaps we should table the background investigation and focus on immediate performance standards. Miss Steele, are you prepared to demonstrate your instructional capabilities under standard evaluation protocols? The compromise offered a way to resolve the immediate situation without delving deeper into classification issues that might be beyond his authority to address. But it also put Harper in the position of having to prove herself according to standards that might not reflect her actual capabilities. Harper looked around at the assembled crowd, taking in the expressions of skepticism, hostility, curiosity, and official concern that surrounded her. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet determination that suggested she'd made a decision about how much of herself she was willing to reveal. "I'm prepared to demonstrate whatever the commander considers appropriate," she said, "but I should point out that standard evaluation protocols might not provide an accurate assessment of specialized operational capabilities." The careful phrasing of her response contained multiple layers of meaning. She was agreeing to the test while simultaneously suggesting that such a test might not reveal her full qualifications. But she was also implying that she possessed specialized operational capabilities that went beyond standard military training. Jackson Blake had heard enough hedging and implication. His approach to problems was direct and physical, and this situation called for clarity rather than diplomatic dancing around classified issues. "Enough," he declared, moving closer to Harper with obvious aggressive intent. "I'm tired of hints and mysteries and bureaucratic nonsense. This is about whether you are qualified to train warriors, and the only way to test that is through direct challenge." His movement brought Ans within Harper's personal space, close enough that his superior size and reach became implicit threats. The other candidates watched with anticipation, while the official observers realized that the situation was about to escalate beyond procedural evaluation into something more personal and potentially dangerous. Ethan Cross stepped forward, his young face showing the kind of moral courage that often got soldiers in trouble with their superiors. "Back off, Blake. This isn't how professionals handle disagreements." Jackson turned on him with immediate fury. "Who asked you, recruit? You've been here 5 minutes and you think you understand how things work? Maybe it's time someone taught you about keeping your mouth shut when your betters are talking." The threat was clear, and Ethan's youth and inexperience made him an easy target for the end of systematic bullying that thrived in hierarchical environments. Several of the other candidates moved to support Jackson, sensing opportunity to gain favor with the Alpha by participating in the humiliation of someone weaker. "He's right, though," one of them added. "New guys should learn their place before trying to white knight for unqualified instructors." The group dynamic was shifting towards something ugly, with Ethan becoming a secondary target simply for having the courage to speak up for basic fairness. Harper watched the development with growing tension, clearly calculating the costs and benefits of different responses. Then Jackson Blake made the decision that would force her hand. Instead of simply intimidating Ethan with words, he reached out to physically shove the younger man backward. The intention was probably just to assert dominance through minor violence, but the action crossed a line that Harper couldn't ignore. What happened next would be analyzed and discussed by military professionals for years to come. Harper moved with fluid precision, intercepting Jackson's aggressive motion with a technique that appeared effortless but was devastatingly effective. Jackson found himself face down on the ground with his arm controlled in a submission hold that could cause serious injury if Harper chose to apply additional pressure. The entire sequence had taken less than 3 seconds and appeared so natural that most observers weren't even sure how it had happened. Jackson was simply standing one moment and controlled on the ground the next, with Harper maintaining perfect leverage and positioning. "Let go of me," Jackson gasped, his voice strained by the uncomfortable position and the shock of being so completely overpowered by someone he'd been dismissing as weak and incompetent. Harper held the position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to demonstrate complete control, but not long enough to cause lasting harm or to appear vindictive. When she released him, Jackson scrambled to his feet with his face red from embarrassment and fury. "That was assault," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. Everyone present had seen him initiate the physical contact, and Harper's response had been proportionate and defensive rather than aggressive. But more importantly, Harper's technique had revealed capabilities that went far beyond anything needed for basic self-defense or standard military training. The precision and efficiency of her movement spoke of extensive close-quarters combat training under demanding conditions. Master Sergeant Williams was staring at Harper with new recognition. That takedown technique, I've only seen that in specialized combatives programs. Advanced Special Operations Training. His observation carried weight among the military professionals present, and it added another piece to the puzzle of D. Harper's true background. Each revelation suggested depth of experience and training that her official position couldn't explain. But Jackson Blake's ego couldn't accept the reality of what had just happened. Being outshot by someone using their weak hand was embarrassing enough, but being physically dominated in front of his peers and superiors threatened the core of his self-image as an elite warrior. "I don't care what tricks you know," he snarled, moving toward Harper again despite having just experienced first-hand evidence of her capabilities. "This isn't about martial arts demonstrations. This is about whether you are fit to train real soldiers for real combat." His renewed aggression was irrational, driven more by wounded pride than tactical thinking, but it also represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what he was dealing with. Harper wasn't just demonstrating tricks. She was revealing systematic training and combat techniques that suggested operational experience under conditions far more demanding than anything these candidates had faced. Commander Reeves had watched the brief confrontation with professional interest, and his assessment was troubling. Harper's defensive technique had been textbook special operations combatives, executed with the kind of precision that came from extensive training and practical application. "Miss Steele," he said formally, "that demonstration raises serious questions about your background and current assignment. I'm going to need immediate clarification about your previous training and operational experience." The official request carried the weight of command authority, but it also put Harper in an impossible position. Providing the requested information might violate security protocols, but refusing to answer would likely result in immediate dismissal and potential disciplinary action. Dr. Hayes had been monitoring Harper's physiological responses throughout the confrontation, and the data was revealing patterns that confirmed her growing suspicions about Harper's background. "Commander," she interjected, "Miss Steele's stress responses during the physical confrontation were consistent with someone who's experienced extensive combat training and real operational stress. These aren't the physiological patterns of someone learning or adapting. They're the patterns of someone applying well-practiced skills under familiar conditions." The medical assessment provided additional evidence that Harper's capabilities weren't the result of lucky adaptation or basic self-defense training. The physiological signatures Dr. Hayes was describing were the product of systematic stress inoculation and combat conditioning that took years to develop. Captain Morrison had been making notes throughout the morning's events, and his tablet now showed a pattern of classification flags and security alerts that painted a very different picture of Harper Steele than her official assignment suggested. "I think it's time for a private conversation," Morrison announced, his tone carrying the authority of someone who'd made a command decision. "Miss Steele, please report to the classified briefing facility immediately. Commander Reeves, I'll need you present as well." The summons to a classified briefing facility implied that Morrison had discovered information requiring elevated security protocols. For Harper, it meant that her carefully maintained cover was about to be either reinforced through official channels or completely blown by someone with access to information beyond the candidate's clearance level. But before anyone could respond to Morrison's directive, the situation was complicated by the arrival of additional personnel who would transform the morning's evaluation into something far more significant. A convoy of black vehicles had pulled up to the range facility, disgorging a group of senior officers whose presence suggested that Harper's situation had attracted attention from very high levels of command. The lead figure was a woman in her 50s, wearing the insignia of a full colonel, her bearing and escort indicating significant authority and urgent purpose. Colonel Bradford approached the group with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she'd been briefed on the morning's events and had come to resolve the situation personally. "Where is Harper Steele?" she asked without preamble. Harper stepped forward, her expression shifting from careful neutrality to something approaching recognition. "Ma'am?" Colonel Bradford studied Harper for a long moment, taking in the bandaged right hand, the left-handed weapon configuration, and the subtle signs of stress and fatigue that came from maintaining an artificial identity under sustained pressure. Ghost 7, she said quietly, using what appeared to be a call sign rather than Harper's name. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Harper's carefully maintained posture of uncertain instructor trying to prove herself evaporated, replaced by the bearing of someone accustomed to operating under extreme conditions with absolute authority. "Ma'am," Harper replied, her voice carrying new levels of respect and recognition. But the exchange had been overheard by everyone present, and the implications were staggering. Ghost 7 wasn't a random call sign. It suggested connection to operational units that didn't officially exist, carrying out missions that couldn't be acknowledged. Jackson Blake stared at the interaction with growing disbelief. Ghost 7? What kind of comic book nonsense is this supposed to be? His dismissive tone revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what was happening. He was still operating under the assumption that Harper was somehow bluffing or exaggerating her qualifications, rather than recognizing that her qualifications might be far beyond anything he could comprehend. Colonel Bradford turned to address the assembled crowd, her expression making it clear that she was about to provide information that would resolve all doubts about Harper's background and capabilities. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying easily across the range, "you've been evaluating someone whose operational record is classified at levels requiring significant clearance to access. What I can tell you is that Harper Steele, Ghost 7, is one of the most highly trained and experienced special operations personnel in the United States military." The revelation hit the group like a physical impact. Everything they'd observed, the left-handed shooting expertise, the combatives' training, the stress tolerance, the technical knowledge, suddenly made sense in a context that dwarfed anything they had imagined. But Colonel Bradford wasn't finished. The ambidextrous combat specialization you've witnessed today was developed during 18 months of rehabilitation following injuries sustained during classified operations in Syria. Operations that resulted in the successful extraction of 47 American personnel under impossible conditions. The additional information transformed Harper from a mysterious instructor of uncertain qualification into a decorated hero whose sacrifices had saved dozens of American lives. The contrast between her actual background and the treatment she'd received that morning created a moment of profound moral reckoning for everyone present. We're approaching the moment that changes everything. Before Harper reveals who she really is, make sure you're subscribed, because this channel tells stories of quiet heroes walking among us. Hit that like button if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of appearance. The comprehensive insurance coverage protecting military contractors included specialized policies designed for high-risk occupations and combat veterans. These premium protection plans offered extensive benefits reaching into millions of dollars, specifically tailored for individuals with exceptional service histories, including comprehensive coverage for PTSD treatment, combat-related injuries, and career transition support for those leaving classified positions. Jackson Blake's world had fundamentally shifted in the space of a few sentences. The woman he'd been mocking and intimidating was not only qualified to train elite soldiers, she was more qualified than anyone present, including himself. The realization created a cognitive dissonance that his ego struggled to process. "This is impossible," he said weakly. "If she's some kind of special operations legend, why is she working as a basic marksmanship instructor? Why hide her background? Why let us treat her like—" He trailed off, unable to complete the sentence that would acknowledge how badly he'd misjudged the situation. Colonel Bradford's expression softened slightly. "Because, Mr. Blake, real warriors don't need to advertise their qualifications to feel important. They serve where they're needed, regardless of whether that service brings recognition or respect." The moral lesson in her words was clear, and it applied not just to Jackson, but to everyone who'd participated in Harper's humiliation that morning. They'd been so focused on appearances and assumptions that they'd failed to recognize genuine competence when it was demonstrated repeatedly before their eyes. Ethan Cross had been listening to the revelations with a mixture of vindication and awe. His intuitive recognition of Harper's capabilities had been correct, but the reality exceeded even his most generous estimates. "Ma'am," he addressed Colonel Bradford respectfully, "when you say Ghost 7, does that refer to a specific unit or operational designation?" The question revealed sophisticated understanding of military classification systems, and Bradford nodded approvingly. "Ghost 7 was part of a joint special operations unit tasked with missions requiring unconventional approaches to problem solving. The unit's operational record is classified, but their success rate was unprecedented. The careful phrasing suggested operations that pushed the boundaries of what could be officially acknowledged, carried out by personnel with capabilities that exceeded standard military training. Captain Morrison had been cross-referencing information on his tablet throughout Bradford's briefing, and the picture emerging from classified databases was staggering. Harper's record included commendations and operational reports that painted a portrait of someone who'd operated at the highest levels of military capability under impossible conditions. "Colonel," Morrison interjected, "if I may ask, why wasn't this information available through standard personnel channels? Miss Steele's official record suggests basic qualifications rather than elite operational background." Bradford's expression grew serious. "Because Ghost 7's transition to a training role was part of a carefully designed rehabilitation and reintegration program. The psychological trauma of losing operational capability can be devastating for people who've defined themselves through elite performance. Allowing her to rebuild her identity through service rather than recognition was considered therapeutic." The explanation revealed layers of consideration and planning that went far beyond simple job assignment. Harper's position as a marksmanship instructor wasn't just a convenient way to utilize her skills. It was part of a comprehensive program designed to help her recover from both physical injuries and psychological trauma. But it also meant that her willingness to endure mockery in doubt, wasn't just professional stoicism. It was part of a healing process that required her to find value in service, regardless of recognition or respect. Dr. Hayes reviewed her physiological monitoring data with new understanding. That explains the stress response patterns I've been observing. Someone with extensive combat experience would develop baseline stability under pressure that wouldn't be affected by social conflict or professional challenges. The medical perspective added another dimension to Harper's remarkable composure throughout the morning's events. She hadn't been unusually calm despite being overwhelmed. She'd been operating within familiar stress parameters that were well within her trained tolerance levels. Commander Reeves found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to reassess not just Harper's qualifications, but his own leadership and judgment. The morning had revealed serious gaps in his understanding of the personnel under his command and the systems designed to support their integration and success. "Colonel Bradford," he said formally, "I owe Miss Steele an apology. My assessment of her capabilities was based on incomplete information and inappropriate assumptions. The public acknowledgement of error took moral courage, especially in front of subordinates who would remember how their commander had handled the situation. But it also demonstrated the kind of professional integrity that separated competent leaders from those who prioritized ego over mission success." Harper's response was immediate and gracious. "No apology necessary, sir. You made reasonable decisions based on available information. That's what good commanders do." Her willingness to absolve Reeves of responsibility revealed the kind of maturity and perspective that came from experience with situations where blame and recrimination were less important than mission success and unit cohesion. But Jackson Blake was struggling with cognitive dissonance that threatened his fundamental sense of self. Everything he'd believed about military hierarchy, personal worth, and natural order had been challenged by the revelation that someone he'd dismissed as weak and incompetent was actually his superior in every meaningful way. "I don't understand," he said, his voice carrying confusion rather than anger. "If you're really Ghost 7, if you're really this elite operator, why didn't you just tell us? Why allow?" Harper looked at him with something approaching sympathy. "Because real strength doesn't need to announce itself, Blake. And because the most important lessons can't be taught through lectures. They have to be learned through experience." The wisdom in her response revealed that the morning's events hadn't been entirely accidental. Harper had allowed the situation to develop because it provided valuable learning opportunities for everyone involved, including painful but necessary lessons about assumption, prejudice, and the difference between appearance and reality. Colonel Bradford consulted her watch and tablet, clearly working within time constraints that suggested urgent scheduling demands. "Ghost 7, she said formally, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your next assignment. The situation in Syria has developed complications that require your specific expertise and experience." The mention of Syria and new assignments created immediate tension in the group. Harper had just been revealed as a decorated veteran recovering from injuries sustained in classified operations, and now she was being called back to operational status for additional missions. "Ma'am," Harper replied carefully, "my medical status currently restricts me to training and support roles. Active operational deployment would require additional evaluation and clearance." The diplomatic response suggested that Harper was willing to serve where needed, but wanted to ensure that her physical limitations wouldn't compromise mission success or unit safety. Bradford nodded understanding. "The evaluation has been completed, and your clearance has been restored. Both hands are now rated fully operational, and your ambidextrous capabilities are considered mission essential for the current operational requirements." The revelation that Harper's medical restrictions had been lifted created another shift in the morning's dynamics. She was no longer a recovering veteran, limited to support roles. She was an active operator being recalled for missions that required her specific and rare capabilities. But it also meant that her time as a marksmanship instructor was ending, which would deprive the training facility of someone whose qualifications far exceeded anything normally available for candidate development. Ethan Cross spoke up with the kind of moral courage that had distinguished him throughout the morning's events. "Ma'am, would it be possible for Ghost 7 to complete our training cycle before reassignment? I think everyone here would benefit from learning from someone with her operational experience." The request was respectfully phrased, but carried implications that went beyond simple schedule coordination. Ethan was asking for Harper to share knowledge and experience that could make the difference between success and failure for operators entering dangerous environments. Bradford considered the request, glancing between Harper and the assembled candidates. That would depend on Ghost 7's willingness to accelerate the normal training timeline and compress advanced operational techniques into a shortened curriculum. Harper looked around at the group that had spent the morning, alternately mocking and trying to understand her. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, whose consistent support had distinguished him from the others, then moved to Jackson Blake, whose confusion and wounded pride made him a candidate for either growth or continued failure. "I can provide advanced training," she said finally, "but it would require complete commitment from everyone involved. No ego, no preconceptions, no assumption that previous experience qualifies you for what you're about to learn." The offer was generous, but came with conditions that would test everyone's willingness to subordinate personal pride to professional development. For someone like Jackson Blake, accepting training from someone he had been humiliating hours earlier would require fundamental changes in attitude and approach. Commander Reeves recognized the opportunity being offered and the organizational benefits it could provide. "I authorize the accelerated training program. Miss Steele, Ghost 7, will have complete authority over curriculum and evaluation standards." The official endorsement created a new dynamic where Harper's authority was both explicit and unquestionable. The candidates who had been challenging her qualifications were now subject to her professional judgment and operational standards. Jackson Blake faced a moment of decision that would define his future in the program and potentially his entire military career. He could continue to resist accepting Harper's authority based on wounded pride and cognitive dissonance, or he could acknowledge reality and commit to learning from someone whose experience exceeded his wildest ambitions. He started, then stopped, clearly struggling with concepts that challenged his fundamental assumptions about strength, competence, and military hierarchy. Harper watched his internal struggle with the kind of patience that came from experience with personality transformation under extreme stress. She'd seen other people confront the gap between their self-image and reality, and she understood that the process was often painful but necessary for growth. "Blake," she said quietly, "the choice you make right now will determine whether you become the warrior you think you are or remain the person you've been. Both options are available, but only one leads to the kind of operational capability that saves lives when it matters." The challenge was offered without malice or condescension, but it carried the weight of someone who'd earned the right to make such pronouncements through demonstrated performance under impossible conditions. Jackson Blake looked around at the faces watching his decision, some hopeful, some skeptical, all recognizing that his response would reveal fundamental aspects of his character and potential. When he spoke, his voice carried new humility and recognition. "I request permission to participate in the accelerated training program under Ghost 7's instruction." The formal phrasing acknowledged Harper's authority and expertise while demonstrating Blake's willingness to subordinate his ego to professional development. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it represented the beginning of growth that could lead to genuine competence rather than superficial confidence. Harper nodded acceptance. Permission granted. Training begins at 0600 tomorrow. Come prepared to discover that everything you think you know about combat operations is probably wrong. The promise was both encouraging and ominous, suggesting that the candidates were about to encounter training methodologies and operational concepts that would challenge their existing knowledge and push them beyond their current capabilities. As the morning's revelations reached their conclusion, the range began to clear of official observers and curious personnel. But the impact of Harper's demonstration would ripple through the base and beyond, creating new understanding of the difference between appearance and capability, between assumption and reality. Colonel Bradford prepared to depart with Harper for mission briefings and operational planning, but she paused to address the candidates one final time. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority of decades of military experience, "you've been given an extraordinary opportunity to learn from someone whose operational achievements exceed anything in your current understanding. Whether you take advantage of that opportunity or waste it through prudent stubbornness will determine your future value as operators and as human beings." The moral challenge in her words was clear. The candidates had a choice between growth and stagnation, between learning from their mistakes or remaining trapped by their limitations. As Harper gathered her equipment and prepared to transition from training instructor back to operational status, she looked once more at the group of candidates who'd provided her with unexpected challenges and revelations about her own capabilities and motivations. The morning had started with questions about her competence and authority. It was ending with recognition of qualifications that exceeded anything the base normally provided for candidate development. But more importantly, it had demonstrated principles about judgment, assumption, and the difference between reputation and reality that would influence everyone present for the rest of their careers. The range fell silent as the official convoy departed, leaving the candidates to process what they'd experienced and prepare for training that would test their commitment to growth and their willingness to accept that true competence came from sources they might never have expected. The shooting challenge that would change everything was about to begin. Harper stood at the firing line, her left hand gripping the replacement rifle that Master Sergeant Williams had personally inspected and verified. The sabotaged weapon had been set aside as evidence, but the damage to Harper's credibility seemed irreversible in the eyes of those who'd witnessed her apparent incompetence. "This is your chance to prove yourself," Commander Reeves announced, his voice carrying across the range with official authority. "Standard precision shooting test, 5 rounds at 200 yards. Minimum score required for instructor qualification." Jackson Blake positioned himself at the adjacent lane, his confidence restored by the morning's earlier events. Despite Harper's mechanical competence with equipment, her actual shooting performance had been disastrous, exactly what he'd predicted from someone trying to operate outside their capabilities. "Left hand versus right hand," Jackson declared loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see how your offhand shooting compares to real marksmanship." The challenge was accepted with reluctant grace by Harper, who seemed to understand that this moment would determine not just her continued employment, but her credibility as a military professional. The assembled crowd of candidates, instructors, and officials created an atmosphere of judgment that would have been intimidating for anyone operating under normal circumstances. Captain Morrison maintained his position at the observation platform, his tablet showing ongoing database searches that were revealing increasingly complex information about Harper's background. Classification flags continued to populate his screen, suggesting depths of clearance and operational history that extended far beyond anything appropriate for a basic marksmanship instructor. "Range is hot," announced the safety officer. "Commence firing when ready." Jackson Blake fired first, his shots deliberate and precise. Years of training and natural ability combined to produce a respectable grouping that demonstrated competent marksmanship under pressure. His confidence grew with each successful shot, reinforcing his belief that superior performance would vindicate his earlier assessments. Harper's approach was different. She seemed to take longer to acquire each target, her left-handed stance appearing awkward despite the technical proficiency she'd demonstrated with equipment handling. When she fired her first shot, the impact was visible through the spotting scope. A clean miss, striking well left of the target center. "There it is," Jackson muttered with satisfaction. "Reality check." Her second shot was even worse, missing not just the bullseye, but the entire scoring area. The crowd murmured with a mixture of disappointment and vindicated skepticism. Even Ethan Cross, who'd been consistently supportive, looked troubled by Harper's apparent failure under pressure. Hayes monitored Harper's physiological responses through the advanced medical equipment, noting patterns that seemed inconsistent with someone experiencing performance anxiety or struggling with unfamiliar techniques. Harper's stress indicators remained remarkably stable, despite the mounting evidence of failure. "Commander," Dr. Hayes called out, approaching Reeves with her tablet, "Miss Steele's biometric readings don't match what I'd expect from someone struggling with the shooting exercise. Her heart rate and cortisol levels suggest someone operating well within their comfort zone." The medical observation added another layer of mystery to Harper's performance. If she wasn't stressed by the apparent failure, it suggested either remarkable psychological resilience or knowledge that others lacked about the situation's true nature. But before anyone could pursue the medical assessment further, the situation escalated in a way that would force all hidden truths into the open. Jackson Blake had completed his shooting with solid results and was feeling magnanimous in victory. His grouping was tight enough to qualify for advanced training, and Harper's continued struggles seemed to validate every assumption he'd made about her limitations. "Don't worry about it," he said, approaching Harper with false sympathy. "Nobody expected you to keep up with real shooters. The important thing is that you tried your best." His condescending tone was designed to appear supportive, while actually emphasizing Harper's apparent failure. The other candidates gathered around, some genuinely sympathetic, but others clearly enjoying the confirmation of their earlier skepticism. "Maybe you should stick to administrative duties," suggested another candidate. "There's no shame in recognizing your limitations." Harper continued preparing for her final shots, her left-handed grip appearing increasingly uncertain as the pressure mounted. She seemed to be struggling with the rifle's weight and configuration, making multiple adjustments that suggested fundamental problems with her shooting stance. "This is painful to watch," Jackson declared, his false sympathy giving way to cruel amusement. "Someone needs to put an end to this embarrassment before it gets worse." He reached out to place what appeared to be a supportive hand on Harper's left shoulder, intending to help her by suggesting she withdraw from the competition before further humiliating herself. But his grip was harder than necessary, more dominating than supportive, designed to emphasize his physical superiority and her vulnerability. "Come on, sweetheart," he said with patronizing firmness. "Time to admit this isn't working out." The fabric of Harper's deep V-neck military shirt was old and worn from months of use. When Jackson's grip tightened and pulled at the shoulder seam, the material gave way with a sharp tearing sound that cut through the range's background noise like a gunshot. The torn fabric exposed Harper's left shoulder completely, revealing skin marked by something that made every observer freeze in stunned recognition. Etched across her shoulder blade in intricate black ink was a detailed tattoo that seemed to absorb the morning light. The centerpiece was a precision sniper rifle rendered with technical accuracy that spoke of intimate familiarity with the weapon system. But surrounding the rifle, arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, were dozens of individual bullet casings, each one detailed down to the brass coloring and primer strikes. The artwork was masterful, but it was the symbolism that created the moment of shocked silence. This wasn't decorative body art chosen for aesthetic appeal. It was a professional marking that told a story of operational history and specialized capability. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds as every mind present processed what they were seeing. Then Captain Morrison's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Ghost Unit Alpha markings," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of recognition and disbelief. "Ambidextrous specialist designation." The words hit the assembled group like a physical impact. Ghost Unit Alpha wasn't just another special operations designation. It was legendary among military professionals, whispered about in classified briefings, and discussed in hushed tones among those with appropriate clearance levels. Harper stood perfectly still, the torn shirt hanging from her shoulders, the tattoo exposed to dozens of pairs of stunned eyes. She made no attempt to cover herself or hide the markings, but something in her expression suggested she'd been hoping to avoid this exact moment of revelation. Jackson Blake's hand fell away from her shoulder, as if he'd been burned. His face cycled through confusion, recognition, and growing horror as the implications of what he was seeing penetrated his consciousness. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Ghost Unit Alpha doesn't exist. Those are just stories, legends, military mythology." But Master Sergeant Williams was staring at the tattoo with the kind of recognition that came from decades of military service and exposure to classified operational briefings. "It exists," he said quietly. "And those markings? Each bullet casing represents a confirmed elimination, That's not mythology. That's an operational record. The revelation transformed Harper from a questionable instructor, struggling with disability, into something far more significant and dangerous. The candidates who had been mocking her apparent limitations were suddenly faced with evidence that she possessed qualifications that exceeded their wildest aspirations. Dr. Hayes approached for a closer examination of the tattoo, her medical training allowing her to recognize details that others might miss. The inkwork is approximately 18 months old, she observed, studying the healing patterns and color saturation. But the scarring underneath suggests older trauma. These markings were applied over existing injury sites. Her medical assessment added another layer to the revelation. The tattoo wasn't just decorative, it was commemorative, applied to mark a significant transition or achievement in Harper's operational career. Commander Reeves had gone pale as he processed the implications of what was unfolding under his command. If Harper was genuinely connected to Ghost Unit Alpha, then his entire assessment of her qualifications and his treatment of her throughout the morning represented a massive failure of leadership and judgment. "Miss Steele," he said formally, his voice carrying new levels of respect and concern, "I need immediate clarification about your operational background and current assignment status." But before Harper could respond, Captain Morrison was receiving urgent communication through his encrypted device. The database searches he'd been conducting had apparently triggered high-level attention, and the responses were creating a cascade of official interest in Harper's situation. "We have incoming," Morrison announced, consulting his tablet. "Senior Command is en route with full authorization to address classification issues and operational security concerns." The mention of Senior Command and classification protocols created immediate tension among the assembled personnel. Most of the candidates lacked the security clearance necessary to be present during discussions of classified operational matters, which meant the situation was about to become even more restricted and official. Ethan Cross had been watching Harper's reactions throughout the revelation, and what he saw troubled him. Instead of relief or vindication at having her qualifications recognized, Harper displayed a kind of resigned acceptance that suggested this exposure was problematic rather than beneficial. "Ma'am," he addressed Harper respectfully, "are you in some kind of trouble because of this? I mean, if your background is supposed to be classified." Harper looked at him with something approaching gratitude for his concern and perceptiveness. "Operational security exists for good reasons," she replied carefully. "Sometimes the best service requires anonymity rather than recognition." Her diplomatic response suggested that her assignment to the training facility had been part of a larger plan that didn't necessarily benefit from public exposure of her true qualifications. But Jackson Blake was struggling with cognitive dissonance that threatened his fundamental understanding of military hierarchy and personal worth. Everything he'd believed about strength, competence, and natural order had been challenged by the revelation that someone he'd been humiliating was actually his superior in every meaningful way. "I don't understand," he said, his voice carrying confusion rather than anger. "If you're really Ghost Unit Alpha, if you're really this elite operative, why are you here? Why work as a basic instructor? Why let us—" He trailed off, unable to complete sentences that would acknowledge how badly he'd misjudged the situation and how poorly he'd behaved based on those judgments. Harper adjusted her torn shirt to provide some coverage while maintaining the exposed tattoo's visibility. When she spoke, her voice carried new authority and confidence that had been carefully hidden throughout the morning's events. "Because real warriors serve where they're needed, Blake, not where they'll be appreciated or recognized. And because some lessons can only be learned through experience rather than instruction." The wisdom in her response revealed that the morning's events hadn't been entirely accidental. Harper had allowed the situation to develop because it provided valuable learning opportunities for everyone involved, including painful but necessary lessons about assumption, prejudice, and the difference between appearance and reality. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the philosophical discussion. A convoy of black SUVs was approaching the range facility with the kind of official escort that suggested very senior command presence and urgent operational priorities. "Time to face the music," Harper murmured, watching the vehicles approach with an expression that mixed resignation and professional acceptance. The lead vehicle disgorged a group of senior officers whose insignia and bearing immediately identified them as high-level command personnel. The central figure was a woman in her 50s wearing colonel's insignia, her movement and escort indicating significant authority and urgent purpose. Colonel Bradford approached the group with focused intensity that suggested she'd been briefed on the morning's events and had come to resolve the situation with decisive action. "Ghost 7, she called out, using Harper's operational designation rather than her cover name. The response was immediate and transformative. Harper's posture shifted from the uncertain bearing of a struggling instructor to the controlled readiness of an elite operator acknowledging superior authority. "Colonel," Harper replied, her voice carrying levels of respect and recognition that hadn't been present in any of her earlier interactions. The exchange confirmed what the tattoo had suggested. Harper wasn't just connected to elite operations, she was an active participant in programs that required the highest levels of clearance and capability. Colonel Bradford surveyed the assembled candidates' bodies and personnel with the kind of assessment that cataloged threats, assets, and complications in seconds. Her gaze lingered on Jackson Blake, whose obvious discomfort and confusion marked him as someone struggling to process new realities. "Gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the range, "you've been conducting evaluation exercises with someone whose operational qualifications are classified at levels requiring significant clearance to access." The formal acknowledgement created another shift in group dynamics. Harper was no longer a questionable instructor trying to prove herself. She was an officially recognized expert whose credentials exceeded anything normally available for candidate training. "The ambidextrous combat capabilities you've witnessed," Bradford continued, "were developed during extensive rehabilitation, following injuries sustained during classified operations that resulted in the successful extraction of 47 American personnel under impossible conditions." The additional information transformed Harper's left-handed shooting from a disability accommodation into evidence of extraordinary dedication and tactical innovation. She hadn't learned to shoot left-handed because she had to. She'd mastered ambidextrous techniques because operational effectiveness required adaptability beyond normal human limitations. Dr. Hayes reviewed her monitoring data with new understanding of what she'd been observing throughout the morning. "That explains the physiological response I've been tracking," she said. "Someone with extensive combat experience would develop stress tolerance that wouldn't be affected by social pressure or performance evaluation." The medical perspective confirmed that Harper's remarkable composure hadn't been unusual calm, despite being overwhelmed. She'd been operating within familiar stress parameters that were well within her trained tolerance levels, but Colonel Bradford's presence indicated more than just credential verification. Her urgency and the size of her escort suggested that Harper was being recalled for active operational duty rather than continued training assignment. "Ghost 7, Bradford said formally, "I'm afraid your rehabilitation period is being terminated early. We have developing situations that require your specific expertise and operational experience." The mention of new operational requirements created immediate tension in the group. Harper had just been revealed as a decorated veteran, and now she was being called back to active duty for missions that apparently couldn't be handled through normal command channels. That revelation just shook everyone to their core. If this story inspired you like it inspired me, share it with your friends and family. Leave a comment about what surprised you most, and don't forget to subscribe for more incredible tales of hidden warriors. Harper's response was immediate and professional. "Ma'am, what's the operational timeline and deployment requirements?" The question revealed that despite her cover assignment, Harper had been maintaining readiness for recall to active duty. Her rehabilitation hadn't been passive recovery. It had been active preparation for return to operational status when circumstances demanded. "Immediate deployment to Syria," Bradford replied. "Intelligence indicates renewed activity by terrorist cells that were involved in the operations that caused your original injuries. Your familiarity with their tactics and operational patterns makes you mission essential for the response team." The revelation that Harper was being called back to confront the same enemies who'd caused her injuries added dramatic weight to the moment. This wasn't just professional duty. It was personal resolution of unfinished business that had cost her 18 months of recovery and rehabilitation. Jackson Blake found his voice amid the mounting revelations. "Ma'am, if Ghost 7 is being deployed to active operations, could the candidates participate in some kind of accelerated training program? I mean, learning from someone with her operational experience?" The request represented a fundamental shift in Blake's attitude. Hours earlier, he'd been challenging Harper's right to be present. Now he was asking for the privilege of learning from her expertise. Colonel Bradford considered the request while consulting her tablet and operational timeline. That would depend on Ghost 7's assessment of candidate potential and her willingness to compress advanced operational concepts into abbreviated instruction. Harper looked around at the group that had spent the morning alternately challenging and trying to understand her. Her gaze lingered on Ethan Cross, whose consistent support had distinguished him throughout the events, then moved to Jackson Blake, whose transformation from antagonist to supplicant represented exactly the kind of growth that elite training was designed to produce. "I can provide accelerated instruction," she said finally, "but it would require complete commitment and willingness to abandon preconceptions about combat effectiveness and operational capability." The offer came with conditions that would test everyone's dedication to learning versus ego protection. For someone like Jackson Blake, accepting advanced training from someone he'd been humiliating hours earlier would require fundamental changes in attitude and approach. Commander Reeves recognized the extraordinary opportunity being offered to his training program. "I authorize the Accelerated Instruction Protocol. Ghost 7 will have complete authority over curriculum, evaluation standards, and candidate selection." The official endorsement created new dynamics where Harper's expertise was both explicit and unquestionable. The candidates who had been challenging her qualifications were now subject to her professional judgment and operational standards that far exceeded anything they'd previously encountered. The advanced tactical training programs available through specialized military education institutions offered comprehensive courses in close quarters combat, precision marksmanship, and strategic planning. These intensive certification programs provided professional development opportunities for security contractors, law enforcement, and military personnel seeking to enhance their operational capabilities through evidence-based methodologies and cutting-edge simulation technology. Jackson Blake faced a moment of fundamental choice that would define not just his military career, but his character development. He could continue resisting Harper's authority based on wounded pride, or he could acknowledge reality and commit to learning from someone whose experience exceeded his previous understanding of what was possible. "Ghost 7, he said formally, the respectful address requiring visible effort but carrying genuine recognition. "I request permission to participate in the accelerated training program under your instruction." Harper studied his expression, reading sincerity versus performance with the kind of assessment skills that came from operational environments where wrong judgments about personnel could be fatal. "Permission granted," she replied. "But understand that this training will challenge everything you think you know about combat operations, personal limitations, and what constitutes real strength." The acceptance came with warnings that suggested Blake was about to encounter methodologies and concepts that would fundamentally alter his understanding of military capability and professional competence. Ethan Cross stepped forward with the kind of moral courage that had characterized his behavior throughout the morning. "Ma'am, I'd also like to request inclusion in the program. Not just for the training, but because I think everyone here learned important lessons today about judgment and respect." His request acknowledged that the morning's events had provided education beyond military tactics, lessons about character, assumption, and the importance of recognizing worth, regardless of appearance or apparent limitation. Harper nodded approvingly. "The most important operational skill isn't marksmanship or physical fitness. It's the ability to see accurately and respond appropriately to what you observe rather than what you expect." Her philosophical observation encapsulated the morning's central lesson, while providing foundation for the advanced training she was offering to provide. Colonel Bradford consulted her operational timeline and made command decisions that would resolve immediate scheduling conflicts. "Ghost 7, you have 72 hours to complete candidate assessment and provide foundational instruction. After that, deployment takes priority over all other assignments." The time constraint created urgency that would test both Harper's instructional capabilities and the candidate's ability to absorb advanced concepts under pressure. But before the training could begin, there were administrative and security matters that required resolution. Harper's exposure as Ghost 7 had created classification issues that needed immediate attention from appropriate authorities. "All personnel without appropriate clearance levels must be debriefed and sign non-disclosure agreements," Bradford announced. "What you've learned today about Ghost 7's background and operational capabilities is classified information that cannot be shared outside official channels." The security protocols transformed the morning's events from training drama into officially classified material that would require legal documentation and ongoing monitoring to prevent unauthorized disclosure. Captain Morrison approached Harper with his tablet showing the complete database search results that had been accumulating throughout the morning. "Ghost 7, he said respectfully. "Your operational record indicates capabilities that extend beyond what we've witnessed today. Would it be appropriate to include advanced technical training in the abbreviated curriculum?" The question revealed that Harper's demonstrated skills were only a fraction of her actual qualifications, and that additional capabilities could be made available to candidates who proved worthy of advanced instruction. Harper considered the request while evaluating the group's readiness for information that would challenge their existing understanding of what was possible in military operations. "Technical capabilities require foundation skills that take months to develop safely," she replied. "But I can provide introduction to concepts and methodologies that will accelerate their future development if they choose to pursue advanced specialization." The offer represented compromise between operational security requirements and educational opportunity that could benefit candidates who demonstrated appropriate dedication and discretion. As the morning's revelations reached their conclusion, the range began clearing of unnecessary personnel, while those involved in the training program prepared for instruction that would challenge their existing knowledge and capabilities. Dr. Hayes completed her medical assessments and provided final observations about Harper's physiological responses throughout the morning's events. Ghost 7's stress tolerance and performance under pressure indicate adaptation to operational environments that exceed normal training simulation, she reported to Colonel Bradford. Her rehabilitation appears to have been completely successful, with enhanced capabilities in some areas beyond original baseline measurements. The medical clearance provided official confirmation that Harper was ready for return to full operational status, with improvements that made her even more capable than before her injuries. Jackson Blake found himself in the position of having to reconcile his morning's behavior with his current understanding of Harper's qualifications and character. The cognitive dissonance was painful, but necessary for growth beyond his previous limitations. "Ghost 7, he said quietly, approaching Harper during a break in official proceedings. "I owe you an apology that goes beyond professional courtesy. I behaved badly, based on assumptions that were completely wrong, and I understand if you decide I'm not suitable for advanced training." The acknowledgement of error required moral courage and represented significant character development for someone who had spent the morning asserting superiority based on unfounded assumptions. Harper's response was measured but not unkind. The ability to recognize error and commit to improvement is more valuable than avoiding mistakes entirely. Everyone here learned something important today, including me. Her gracious acceptance of his apology demonstrated the kind of leadership and character that distinguished elite operators from those who merely possessed technical skills. The training program that followed would compress months of advanced instruction into intensive sessions that tested every participant's physical, mental, and emotional capabilities. Harper's methodologies challenged conventional approaches to combat training while providing insights into operational effectiveness that couldn't be acquired through normal military education. But the most important lessons weren't technical. They were philosophical and character-based, focusing on the difference between appearance and capability, assumption and assessment, ego and effectiveness. By the end of the 72-hour training period, every participant had been fundamentally changed by exposure to Harper's expertise and perspective. Jackson Blake emerged as a more thoughtful and capable leader who understood that real strength often appeared in unexpected forms. Ethan Cross developed advanced skills that positioned him for special operations selection and elite unit assignment. But perhaps most importantly, the entire group learned that judgment based on appearance and assumption was not just morally wrong, but tactically dangerous in environments where accurate assessment could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As Harper prepared for deployment to Syria and her return to active operational status, she reflected on the unexpected value of her training assignment. The morning's events had provided education for everyone involved, including herself, about the importance of service regardless of recognition and the satisfaction that came from developing others, rather than just accomplishing missions. Her left shoulder, now proudly displaying the Ghost Unit Alpha markings for all to see, represented not just her operational achievements, but her commitment to continued service in whatever form circumstances demanded. The phone call that interrupted her final preparations came through encrypted channels that indicated highest priority operational requirements. Ghost 7, this is Blackbird, the voice announced, using communication protocols that Harper recognized from her most classified assignments. Siria's situation has evolved. We have confirmed intelligence that the terrorist cell responsible for your original injuries has acquired advanced weapons systems and is planning coordinated attacks against American installations. The intelligence update added personal stakes to Harper's deployment. This wasn't just another mission. It was an opportunity to resolve unfinished business with enemies who'd caused significant damage to American operations and personnel. Understood, Blackbird, Harper replied. What's the operational team composition and mission parameters? Full Ghost Unit Alpha recall, came the response. All surviving members are being reactivated for coordinated response. Mission parameters are elimination of terrorist capability and recovery of captured American personnel. The revelation that Ghost Unit Alpha was being reconstituted for this mission added dramatic weight to Harper's deployment. She would be rejoining teammates who'd shared her original trauma and working to rescue personnel who were facing the same dangers they'd all survived. But it also meant that her time as a training instructor was definitively ending, which would deprive future candidates of access to her expertise and perspective. Jackson Blake approached her during final equipment preparation, his expression carrying genuine respect and concern. Ghost 7, he said formally, I know we don't have the right to ask, but is there any possibility of future training opportunities? I mean, what we learned in 72 hours changed everything about how I understand military operations. The request represented recognition that Harper's instruction had provided value that couldn't be replicated through normal training channels, and that losing access to her expertise would limit future development opportunities. Harper considered the question while securing her specialized equipment for deployment. When she responded, her voice carried the kind of wisdom that came from experience with sacrifice and service. Real learning doesn't end when the instructor leaves, she said. Everything I taught you becomes part of your foundation for continued growth. The question isn't whether you'll have access to my specific instruction, it's whether you'll apply what you learned to become the kind of operator who can teach others. The philosophical response challenged Blake to think beyond passive learning toward active development and leadership that would multiply the impact of Harper's brief instruction period. As the deployment vehicles arrived and Harper prepared to leave for Syria, Ethan Cross made a decision that would influence his entire military career. Ghost 7, he announced formally. I'm requesting transfer to Special Operations Selection and application for Ghost Unit Alpha consideration when positions become available. The declaration represented commitment to pursuing the highest levels of military capability and service, inspired by exposure to Harper's example and instruction. Harper smiled with genuine pride and approval. Application noted and endorsed, but remember, selection requires more than technical skills. It requires the kind of character and judgment you demonstrated today when you stood up for what was right, despite social pressure. Her endorsement carried significant weight in special operations communities, and her character assessment would influence Ethan's future opportunities and development. The final departure was accomplished with minimal ceremony but maximum emotional impact. Harper had arrived at the training facility as an unknown instructor with questionable qualifications. She was leaving as a recognized elite operator whose brief presence had transformed everyone she'd encountered. Colonel Bradford's final assessment summarized the morning's lessons and their broader implications for military training and leadership development. Today demonstrated that our most valuable assets often appear in unexpected forms, she announced to the assembled personnel. The ability to recognize and develop talent, regardless of appearance or assumption, is essential for organizational effectiveness and mission success. As Harper's convoy departed for deployment, the training facility was forever changed by the recognition that strength, competence, and value often wore humble disguises that required wisdom and humility to perceive accurately. The candidates who remained would carry forward lessons about judgment, character, and service that would influence their entire careers and their interactions with others who might not fit conventional expectations of military capability. And somewhere in Syria, terrorist cells who thought they'd eliminated Ghost Unit Alpha 18 months earlier were about to discover that some ghosts couldn't be killed. They could only be temporarily displaced before returning with enhanced capabilities and unfinished business to resolve. The story of Harper Steele, Ghost 7, had begun as a tale of hidden strength revealed through adversity. It was ending as a reminder that true warriors served where needed, learned from every experience, and used their capabilities to develop others rather than just accomplish missions. Her left shoulder, bearing the intricate tattoo that told the story of her operational achievements, would carry those markings into new battles where ambidextrous skills and tactical innovation would once again prove that adaptation and determination could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the most important legacy she left behind wasn't tactical knowledge or technical skills. It was the understanding that respect, competence, and worth couldn't be determined by appearance or assumption, and that the most dangerous underestimation was believing that strength always announced itself, rather than hiding in plain sight until circumstances demanded its revelation.